The ice didn't just crack. It screamed. Deep within the frozen valleys of 1342, Mave Dunmore dragged 11 monstrous freezing wolves from a watery grave, completely unaware that the 12th and largest beast she pulled from the abyss was no animal. It was the ruthless Alpha King himself. The winter of 1342 had settled over the northern marches like an iron shroud. In the isolated borderlands of Oak Haven, the frost did not merely bite. Consumed. The trees stood like skeletal sentinels, their branches encased in thick, milky ice that groaned under the weight of a relentless northern gale. For Mave Dunmore, the brutal weather was just another adversary in a life defined by survival. At 24, Mave was the last of her line, living in a secluded stone cottage near the treacherous Blackwater Gorge. Her father, once a revered master huntsman for the High Lords, had died in exile after a political shift left their family name ruined. Mave had inherited his strength, his deep knowledge of the wilderness, and his absolute refusal to break under pressure. She survived by trading rare winter roots and treated pelts with the distant village of Kell, though she rarely spoke to anyone. The villagers whispered that she was too wild, a creature of the woods herself. On a bitter Tuesday afternoon, as the pale sun dipped below the jagged mountain peaks, Mave was securing the external storm shutters of her cabin. The wind carried a strange, heavy scent, the metallic tang of blood mixed with the sharp, electric aroma of ozone. Then came the sound. It wasn't the standard sharp howl of a timber wolf, nor was it the high-pitched yip of a coyote. It was a deep, resonant, vibrating rumble of pure agony that shook the very ground beneath her leather boots. It was a chorus of despair, muffled by thick ice and rushing water. Mave froze, her amber eyes narrowing as she listened. The sound came from the Blackwater River, a violent stretch of water that ran through a deep ravine less than a mile from her home. The river was notorious for its deceptive ice shelves, thick enough to look sturdy but hollowed out underneath by raging sub-zero rapids. Without a second thought, Mave grabbed her father's heavy logging ropes, a pair of thick iron-hooked poles, and her skinning knife. She threw her heavy wool cloak over her shoulders and sprinted into the blinding white of the forest, following the sound of the dying beasts. When she reached the lip of the ravine, the scene below took her breath away. The ice shelf over the deepest part of the river had collapsed entirely. In the churning, slush-filled black water, a pack of wolves was drowning. But as Mave slid down the snowy embankment, she realized these were no ordinary predators. They were historic beasts, easily 3 times the size of any wolf she had ever encountered. Their shoulders were as broad as war horses, their fur thick and dark as midnight. They were caught in a deadly trap. The rapid current was pulling them beneath the remaining ice sheets, where they would be trapped and suffocated within minutes. Several were already clawing desperately at the slippery edges of the ice, their whimpers cutting through the howling wind. "Hold on," Mave muttered to herself, her survival instincts overriding her fear. If she stopped to think about the danger of approaching 12 giant predators, she would freeze. She anchored her thick hemp rope around the base of a massive ancient oak tree near the riverbank. Tying the other end securely around her waist, she grabbed the iron-hooked pole and stepped onto the unstable edge of the riverbank. The first wolf she reached was a hulking soot-gray beast. It was thrashing wildly, its violet-tinted eyes wide with animal panic. Mave threw the loop of her second rope over its massive head, managing to cinch it around its thick chest. "Pull!" she screamed against the wind, using her entire body weight and leaning back against the anchor rope tied to the oak tree. Her muscles burned instantly. The weight of the beast was staggering, easily 600 pounds of wet, freezing muscle. She dug her iron-shod boots into the frozen earth, her hands blistering through her leather gloves as she hauled. With a final agonizing heave, the gray wolf scrambled onto the muddy bank, collapsing and coughing up black river water. Instead of turning to attack her, the beast lay shivering, staring at Mave with an unnerving, almost human intelligence. There was no time to ponder it. Mave threw herself back toward the water. One by one, the grueling cycle continued. The second wolf, a silver-furred female, was dragged out by her scruff, her hind legs nearly paralyzed by the cold. The third and fourth, twin jet-black males, were tangled together in a submerged thicket. Mave had to use her iron pole to pry them free before hauling them up simultaneously, nearly dislocating her own shoulder in the process. By the seventh wolf, Mave's breath was coming in ragged, painful gasps. The skin on her palms had torn open, staining the hemp rope with her own warm crimson blood. By the 11th wolf, a massive scarred brute that looked like it had survived a dozen wars, Mave was operating on pure adrenaline. Her vision was tunneling. The wind chill had dropped significantly, and her own clothes were soaked through with freezing spray. As the 11th wolf crawled onto the snow, it joined the others. The 11 giant beasts did not flee, nor did they fight. They huddled together on the bank, forming a silent, shivering semicircle. Their intelligent amber and blue eyes locked onto the exhausted human woman who had just saved their pack. Mave fell to her knees, her chest heaving, believing the ordeal was over. Her hands were trembling violently from the onset of hypothermia. She looked out at the churning black water, ready to pack her ropes and drag herself back to her cabin. Then the water erupted through the fractured ice. A final figure rose and Mave's heart stopped. This beast was a titan, a leviathan among monsters. He was nearly double the size of the others, his coat a magnificent blend of midnight velvet and stark frosted white. But what caught Mave's attention wasn't just his terrifying size. It was the fact that he was dying. A massive, heavy-set crossbow bolt, forged of blackened iron and tipped with gleaming silver, was buried deep into his shoulder. The flesh around the wound was smoking, turning a sickly charred black, as if the metal itself were burning him alive. The water around him was stained with a heavy torrent of dark, thick blood. The giant wolf's eyes met Mave's. They were not the eyes of a beast. They were piercing, majestic sapphire blue, radiating an overwhelming, crushing aura of absolute authority. Even as life faded from them, it was a look of profound, tragic dignity. He was slipping beneath the ice shelf, his massive paws losing their grip on the slick surface. "No!" Mave cried out, the word torn from her raw throat. She couldn't let him die. Not after everything. Ignoring the screaming protests of her exhausted muscles, Mave unhitched herself from the anchor tree. The rope wouldn't reach far enough. She had to venture onto the cracking ice sheet itself. Behind her, the 11 rescued wolves let out a collective low whine, a sound of absolute terror for the giant in the water. Mave stepped onto the ice. It cracked beneath her boots, a spiderweb of fractures spreading rapidly toward the deep water. She ignored it. She lunged forward, dropping to her stomach to distribute her weight, and plunged her bare, bleeding arms directly into the sub-zero water. The pain was instantaneous and blinding, a white-hot flash that felt like her flesh was being scraped from her bones. She reached down, her fingers tangling into the thick, coarse scruff of the white and midnight titan. The wolf groaned, a sound that vibrated through Mave's very bones. He had no strength left to help himself. He was a dead weight sinking into the black abyss. "Help me!" Mave screamed, though she didn't know who she was calling to. Suddenly, she felt a massive pressure around her waist. The 11th wolf, the scarred brute she had saved just minutes prior, had stepped onto the stable edge of the bank. He clamped his massive jaws onto the tail end of Mave's trailing rope and began to pull backward with immense force. The other wolves joined, grabbing the rope in their teeth and acting as a living winch. With the collective power of the pack, and Mave's final desperate, bone-cracking heave, the titan was ripped from the freezing maw of the river. The ice beneath Mave gave way entirely. She fell into the shallow edge, but the wolves were already moving. The silver female grabbed Mave by the hood of her heavy cloak, dragging her safely onto the snowy bank alongside the massive unconscious leader. Mave lay in the snow, coughing, her vision fading to black at the edges. She was freezing to death. She knew the signs. If she didn't get to heat immediately, she would not see the sunrise. But as she lay there, a strange warmth enveloped her. The 11 giant wolves moved in a synchronized protective wall. They pressed their massive fur-covered bodies tightly around her, shielding her from the biting wind. The intense, Unnatural body heat radiating from the beasts was like a furnace, stopping Maeve's violent shivering and bringing the color back to her pale cheeks. After an hour of resting in the living fortress of fur, Maeve managed to stand. The Titan was still unconscious, his breathing shallow and rattling. The silver wound on his shoulder was weeping black fluid. "We have to move him," Maeve whispered, her voice cracking. She looked at the wolves. To her utter astonishment, they seemed to understand. Maeve retrieved her large wooden logging sled from the top of the ridge, a sled used for hauling massive oak logs. Together, using her ropes and the physical assistance of two of the largest black wolves, who pushed with their massive snouts, they managed to roll the colossal Titan onto the sled. The journey back to the cabin was a surreal nightmare. A frail human woman and 11 mythical monsters moved in perfect, silent unison through the blizzard, hauling their dying king. When they reached the cabin, the wolves crowded around the porch, their massive bodies completely blocking the wind. Only the scarred brute and the silver female assisted Maeve in dragging the Titan inside, his massive body taking up the entirety of the braided rug before her stone hearth. Maeve immediately set to work. She stoked the fire until the room was roaring with heat. She fetched her medical supplies, her father's old surgical tools, heavy iron pliers, and jars of dried wintergreen, comfrey, and a rare secret root her father called wolfsbane, used to treat toxic metallic poisonings. The silver bolt buried in the beast's shoulder was pure malice. Maeve could smell the burning flesh. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, placing a gentle hand on the Titan's massive, soft ear. She gripped the end of the iron bolt with her heavy pliers, straddling the wolf's massive chest to keep him pinned. She braced herself and pulled with all her might. The Titan erupted into motion. Even unconscious, the agony was so great that a deafening, earth-shattering roar tore from his throat, rattling the iron pots hanging from the kitchen ceiling. His massive paws flailed, his claws digging deep furrows into Maeve's wooden floorboards. Maeve was thrown back, but she held on. With a wet, sickening sound, the silver bolt tore free from his flesh. She threw it into the fire, where it hissed violently. Working quickly, she packed the gaping wound with her crushed herbal paste and wrapped it tightly with clean linen sheets, tying them securely around his massive torso. By the time she finished, she was covered in sweat, dirt, and the dark blood of the beast. The Titan's breathing gradually stabilized, the black veins around the wound receding as the healing process began. The other wolves outside let out a low collective hum of relief that vibrated through the log walls. Exhausted beyond human limits, Maeve collapsed on the floor beside the hearth, just inches away from the giant white and midnight wolf. She rested her head against his massive, soft flank, her hand remaining on his steady, beating heart. Within seconds, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, surrounded by a pack of apex predators. Hours passed. The blizzard outside reached its crescendo and then slowly died away, leaving the world in a pristine, suffocating silence. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the frost-rimed windows of the cabin, Maeve began to stir. The heavy, comforting smell of wet dog and wild fur was gone. Instead, the air in the cabin was thick with the sharp, overwhelming scent of copper, ancient pine, and something deeply masculine, like ozone and expensive leather. Maeve opened her eyes, blinking against the morning light. She wasn't resting against soft fur anymore. Her head was pillowed against something solid, warm, and distinctly smooth. She bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. The wolves were gone. The cabin was packed to the brim, but not with animals. Standing in a perfect, rigid semicircle around her living room were 11 towering, incredibly muscular men. They were clad only in remnants of fur cloaks and salvaged blankets, their expressions fierce, noble, and etched with an intense, reverent solemnity. Maeve gasped, scrambling backward until her spine hit the stone hearth. Her eyes darted to the bed in the corner of her room, the bed where she had managed to shift the weight of the wounded beast using her pulleys during the night. Lying on her small cot, his long legs hanging off the edge, was a man. He was breathtakingly massive, with a chest as wide as an anvil covered in ancient battle scars. His hair was a wild mane of midnight black, streaked with shocks of stark white at the temples. Wrapped tightly around his broad shoulder were the bloody linen bandages she had applied the night before. The man opened his eyes. They were the same piercing, majestic sapphire blue eyes she had seen in the freezing water. The 11 towering men in the room instantly dropped to one knee, bowing their heads in absolute, terrifying unison. The man on the bed looked down at his bandaged shoulder, then at the blood on Mave's hands, and finally directly into her eyes. A low, gravelly voice, rich with a power that made the very air in the room feel heavy, broke the silence. "You saved my pack, little bird," the man murmured, a faint, dangerous smile touching his lips. "And you pulled the sovereign of the northern brood from the gates of death." He paused, holding her gaze. "Tell me, what is a human girl to do with an alpha king?" Mave could only stare, her breath catching in her throat, as she realized the true depth of the wild world she had just stumbled into. She hadn't just saved a pack of wild animals. She had altered the political landscape of the entire continent. And there was no turning back. The silence in the small firelit cabin stretched until it became a physical weight pressing down on Mave's chest. The 11 towering men remained absolutely motionless, their heads bowed in total submission, while the colossal man on the cot watched her with eyes that held the terrifying depth of a frozen ocean. The crackle of the hearth fire seemed deafening. Mave pressed her spine harder against the cold stone of the chimney, her breathing shallow and fast. She was a woman accustomed to the wild, a survivor of the brutal northern marches. But nothing in her father's extensive journals had prepared her for the impossible reality standing in her living room. "You look at us as if we are ghosts," the man on the bed rumbled. His voice was a rich, vibrating baritone that resonated in the hollow of Mave's ribs. He shifted his massive weight, wincing slightly as the muscles in his chest pulled against the tight linen bandages she had wrapped around his shoulder just hours prior. "I assure you, little bird, we are entirely made of flesh and blood. Thanks to you." Mave swallowed hard, forcing her vocal cords to function. You were wolves, the beasts in the river. I dragged you from the ice." "You did," the man agreed slowly, swinging his long, muscular legs over the edge of the cot. Despite his severe injuries, he moved with the languid, lethal grace of an apex predator. "I am Gideon, sovereign of the northern brood. These men are my vanguard, my most elite guard. And you, human, have accomplished something that entire armies have failed to do." He held her gaze. "You saved my life." "How?" Mave whispered, her amber eyes darting around the room, taking in the scarred, muscular bodies of the vanguard. They wore only the ragged remnants of the heavy furs and woolen blankets she had stored in her cedar chests. Yet they seemed completely unaffected by the freezing drafts slipping through the cabin's floorboards. "How did you end up drowning in the Blackwater Gorge? You are giants. You could tear a bear apart. A river shouldn't have been able to take you." A dark, dangerous shadow crossed Gideon's face. The sapphire blue of his eyes seemed to darken into a stormy, violent navy. He looked toward the largest of his men, the scarred brute Mave had pulled from the water 11th. The man had jagged silver scars crisscrossing his broad chest and face, matching the wounds of the wolf he had been. "We were not defeated by the wilderness, Mave Dunmore." The scarred man spoke, his voice like grinding stones. Mave gasped, slightly shocked that they knew her family name. "I am Gareth. We were driven into the gorge, herded like sheep by men wielding cowardly weapons." "Hunters?" Mave asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "No local trapper from Kell would dare hunt wolves your size. They are terrified of the woods in winter." "They were not local trappers," Gideon interjected, his gaze piercing hers. "They were mercenaries, heavily armed and handsomely paid. They carried black iron ballistas mounted on heavy sleds loaded with bolts forged from pure, consecrated silver. The poison that burned in my shoulder was designed specifically for our kind. We were ambushed in the narrow pass of the Whispering Peaks. They drove us toward the fragile ice of the Blackwater." Mave felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Who would have the gold and the resources to hunt a pack of werewolf royalty in the middle of a blizzard? William de Bohun. Gideon spat the name like venom. The Earl of Northampton. The Plantagenet crown has grown tired of the treaties that keep the northern forests under our jurisdiction. They want the timber, the silver mines, and the strategic mountain passes. To get them, they need the northern brood eliminated. The Bohuns financed a private army of silver hunters to wipe out my vanguard and assassinate me. Maeve's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a solitary woman, exiled and forgotten by the political machinations of the High Lords. Now she was standing in the epicenter of a hidden war between the English crown and a supernatural monarchy. She looked at her hands, still stained with dried dark blood from hauling the wolves from the river. If William de Bohun's mercenaries drove you into the water, Maeve's voice trailed off as a horrifying realization washed over her. She rushed to the frost-covered window, using her sleeve to rub away the condensation. Outside, the blizzard had broken, leaving a pristine, sunlit expanse of deep, untouched white snow. But her eyes weren't looking at the beauty of the morning. They were looking at the treeline. "They won't believe you drowned," Maeve whispered. Her survival instincts instantly hijacked her fear. She turned back to Gideon, her expression hardening into that of a huntsman's daughter. "Silver hunters are trackers. They will follow the riverbank. They will find the broken ice. And they will find the massive drag marks my wooden sled made in the snow leading straight to my front door."